for our families. And the option that we have is to either let them suffer with nothing or to allow this greed and billions of dollars, which will be leveraged into trillions of dollars, to contribute to the largest income inequality gap in our future. There should be shame about what was fought for in this bill and the choices that we have to make.
Gentlelady's time's expired.
And I yield.
Gentleman from Maryland reserved. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Riggleman.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It wasn't so long ago that our country experienced an event that would bring Americans together to fight a common enemy and help those in need. On September 11, 2001, America experienced the worst act of terrorism in its history. The resolve and patriotism I felt that day as a warfighter is so very similar to the resolve and patriotism I feel today. Government can do some things for the American people. The CARES Act is not perfect, but it provides much needed funds for medical equipment, support for small businesses, and additional tools to fight the crisis. This bill is a step forward, and when combined with the same American spirit that brought us through 9/11 and crises past, we can come out of this stronger. The true strength of our great nation is what people do for each other. Rugged individualism turns into compassionate sacrifice. The charity of American spirit expands and envelops all others. We see those in need, we act, we volunteer, we lead, we step into the breach. Almost nothing perfect comes out of government. Service, however, demands that we put forth a perfect effort to do the best we can.
Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Speaker, I now have the privilege of yielding to a gentlelady from Northwest Illinois, the heartland of our country, and one of the leaders of our party, Sherry Bustos from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Leader.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute. For 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the CARES Act. Yesterday, the United States became the country with the most known COVID-19 cases in the world, and we are all concerned for our families, for our friends, for our farmers, for our futures. But today, we have the opportunity to take a step forward, to come together, even as we must stand apart, to help our fellow Americans, to strengthen our communities, and to face this threat as one. Illinois workers are afraid they will lose their jobs, if they have not already. Small businesses are making hard decisions between keeping staff or closing their doors. And our farmers, who have already endured so much pain, are worried sick about what is ahead this year, not only because of this worldwide pandemic, but also because of the threats of more flooding. That is why I join my colleagues on the floor today to cast my vote for the most significant relief package in American history. This vital legislation will help struggling Americans make ends meet. It will expand unemployment insurance to help those who lose their jobs through no fault of their own. It will help small businesses secure precious dollars to keep their employees and communities afloat. And it will help our farmers, who have always stood with us, to provide much-needed resources to feed the world. This bill is not perfect, no bill ever is, but it is the strong medicine we need to defeat this invisible enemy. Let us come together today to pass this bill and declare that no virus will ever tear this country apart. With that, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this unprecedented economic relief package in response to these unprecedented times. It is clear this pandemic is having a profound impact on the American people. It is our job to make sure that this impact is not a lasting one. Especially clear is just how devastating this crisis is hitting rural communities like those in central Washington. This bill provides desperately needed relief to rural hospitals, many of which are the only health care provider for a great number of my constituents. It will support the agricultural industry to ensure hardworking farmers and ranchers can continue to provide food security for our nation. And it will provide stability for workers and small business owners who are the backbone of our local economies. Mr. Speaker, this is a 9/11 moment, a time to put partisan differences aside, policy goals aside, and work together as Americans for the people of our nation. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cisneros, for 1 minute.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the gentleman for yielding. As you all know, our country is in a crisis, and the American people are looking for Congress for action and leadership. That is why I stand in support of the CARES Act, which provides our workers, small businesses, healthcare workers, and so many more in California's 39th district the relief they need. Whether it's to provide PPE and medical equipment to our healthcare workers, financial support for our workers without jobs, or resources for our small businesses, Congress is taking significant steps to help our communities. At the same time, we're enforcing strict oversight to prevent secret bailouts and ensure that those on the front lines of our global epidemic come first. While the CARES Act throws a lifeline to our workers and our economy, we will need to do more. There's not a single community across the United States that hasn't been affected by the coronavirus in some way. That's why our next stimulus package must provide direct funding for our cities and towns with less than 500,000 residents. Although we have had to be physically apart, our community and our country have come together with the American spirit and determination needed to help us get through this crisis.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Puerto Rico, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Gentlelady from Puerto Rico is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The CARE Act ensures that all citizens in Puerto Rico are treated equally under the federal grants and benefits incorporated in this bill, which I strongly support. Puerto Rico has been in a lockdown since March 15, and more than 48,000 people lost their jobs already. This bill, our small businesses, that people, and the nutritional assistance program, as well as the health industry, to tackle those issues. Puerto Rico as well are ready because we have the infrastructure of a great pharmaceutical and skilled workforce that stands ready to ramp up and deliver medications, devices, when backed up by the Defense Production Act. We need to rebuild our American workforce in a domestic territory. That's the reason I thank the President, the leadership of the Senate, and the House for putting together this economic health package to give our localities the resources to tackle this crisis affecting our nation so we can focus on staying safe and healthy. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of it.
The gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I inquire of the time that is left for both sides?
The gentleman from Maryland has 52.5 minutes. From Texas has 63 minutes.
63?
63 minutes.
Thank you. I now yield to the former chairman of our campaign committee, extraordinary candidate for the United States Senate in New Mexico, my friend Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico. 2 minutes.
Gentleman from New Mexico is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my friend, the Majority Leader. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of legislation before us. We're living in uncertain times. This virus has drastically reshaped each one of our communities, and there's likely more change to come. Today, Americans need us. They need the support and resources provided by this bipartisan legislation. They need access to protective equipment, a personal safety net, and economic assistance. Workers need assurances that their economic security is paramount because it is the American worker at the cornerstone of our economy. In this bill, I fought so that trade workers and engineers employed at New Mexico's national labs can continue protecting our national security mission. We cannot let them down. We must pass this bill for the teacher who is delivering meals to students to make sure they don't go hungry just because they're not in the classroom. We must pass this bill for nurses, doctors, healthcare professionals, and first responders who haven't slept as they provide for the sick. We must pass this bill for rural communities who need the lifeline to ensure seniors are fed and individuals can access healthcare when the nearest doctor is hundreds of miles away. We must pass this for everyone who is fighting to keep one another safe, healthy, and afloat. We cannot let them down. The reality we wake up to each day may change, but what remains the same is that we face this crisis together. And like every crisis we have faced before, we will get through this together. Passage of this legislation is an important step, but I want every New Mexican and every American to know that we understand this uncertain time demands an extraordinary response. And together, we will not let each other down, and we will meet that challenge. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from West Texas, Mr. Arrington.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the Greek physician Hippocrates once said, "For extreme diseases, extreme methods of cure are most suitable." And while this medicine will have some short-term side effects, it's our best hope for curing the crisis. Our nation is fighting a global pandemic and the prospects of a looming national disaster. While I have serious concerns with some bad policies, partisan provisions, and the overall price tag of this legislation, I'm more concerned about inaction, delaying support for millions of hurting Americans, and the threat of an even costlier recession for our country. This national emergency has wreaked havoc on our country and upended every aspect of our lives. We must move quickly to provide temporary relief for our working families, small businesses, and frontline healthcare professionals. Mr. Speaker, this is uncharted territory. This is an unprecedented crisis. Extraordinary circumstances call for extraordinary measures. I stand united with my colleagues and my countrymen in these difficult days. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have the privilege of yielding 1 minute. The distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank my good friend from Maryland, the Majority Leader. America is bleeding. America is in deep suffering and even deeper anxiety. It counts on its Congress to respond with alacrity and thoughtfulness and action. We have no time to dither. We have no time to engage in ideological or petty partisan fights. Our country needs us as one. 3.28 million people filed for unemployment last week. In my state, that translated into a 17-fold increase in 1 week. The number of coronavirus victims quadrupled in that time period in my state. And those figures are reflected throughout the country. Now is the time to come together. Now is the time to show our fellow countrymen we can rise to this occasion and reinstill in them the hope and confidence that will come.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland is reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Ohio, Dr. Winstrup.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Americans are suffering. They're suffering in the face of an unseen enemy, a natural disaster that we can only defeat together. I've spent hours on the phone with Ohioans and national leaders, doctors, researchers, elected officials, business and community leaders, listening to what they are doing to help us through this crisis and asking what they need. This bill is not perfect, but it does provide emergency relief legislation that helps our healthcare workers, our hospitals, our businesses with liquidity, and helps our workers to keep them on the payroll, as well as helping Americans most in need. We see businesses retooling their industry. We see groups donating supplies and others seeking cures. We're learning many lessons, finding many flaws that we must fix. So we have the opportunity to come back even stronger and more responsible than ever. We need to pass this bill. This time is very unprecedented. Let's get it done. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to one of the senior members of the Congress of the United States, a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, representing the committee, the distinguished Jan Schakowsky from Chicago, Illinois.
Jeff, how much time?
4 minutes.
Gentlelady is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to be here as a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And I rise, as we all know, during one of the most challenging moments in the history of our country, and I would say the world. Americans are hurting and families are suffering. The calls that are coming to my office, and I'm sure yours too, are just heartbreaking. But today we will pass a bill that will provide critical relief to begin the healing in our communities. And despite, I have to say, the failure of leadership from our president, Congress has in fact stepped up. And thanks to the unity of House and Senate Democrats, we pushed the Republican initial proposal from corporate first to families and workers first. We fought for and won a $100 billion investment in hospitals and healthcare systems that our doctors and nurses on the front line are fighting with the coronavirus, often without the equipment that they need. And I implore the president to fully invoke the Defense Production Act so that our frontline workers will have the protective gear that they need and right now are not getting. The CARES Act will also provide double the unemployment insurance benefits that Republicans initially proposed. That this will help countless restaurant workers and small business employees who call my office and say, we need help. Thanks to Democrats, the small business owners in my district will now be able to make payroll with their mortgages and utility costs eligible for Small Business Administration loan forgiveness. And sadly, this bill isn't all that it could be. I am deeply disturbed that my Republican colleagues are trying to exclude local Planned Parenthood clinics from this small business financing, and especially since they are these clinics are helping people every single day to be able to get the health care they need. And I'm also really disappointed that they took this opportunity to irrelevantly add to this the Hyde Amendment. I want to especially take the time to thank the people that are working today. And I'm glad to be here among you doing just that. But we are seeing people that are outside here, the Capitol Police, people that are helping to clean our environment, that people that are now working at jobs like the people in my grocery store, the Jewel food store in my neighborhood, where the people who are bagging my groceries, who are loading my shelves, who are taking my money in order to buy the food that all the people in my community need, they are risking their lives too and deserve the kind of thanks. I want to thank my governor, Governor J.B. Pritzker, who has actually created a response fund that will put money into community organizations and not-for-profits that can help people that aren't covered here, that need to be covered in the next bill. I'm talking about immigrants, undocumented people.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to yield 3 minutes to the chair of the Republican Conference, the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney.
Gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 67 years ago yesterday, Dr. Jonas Salk announced that the United States had successfully tested a vaccine to prevent polio, a dreaded virus that afflicted tens of thousands of Americans. Mr. Speaker, we have beaten terrible diseases before, and we will again. When we were attacked on 9/11, our heroes were the firefighters and police officers who ran towards the burning buildings, the citizens who stormed the cockpit of Flight 93, who put their own lives at risk. Mr. Speaker, we have those same heroes today. Today, they are the thousands of nurses and doctors and countless other healthcare professionals and their staff who work in our hospitals and clinics and provide the greatest care anywhere in the world. We owe them our deepest gratitude. But, Mr. Speaker, we also owe them every tool, every piece of equipment, and every resource they need to save lives. Mr. Speaker, we also have a duty to our parents and our grandparents. In this greatest nation on earth, we protect the sick and the most vulnerable. We owe all we have to our mothers and our fathers, to the generations who came before, and we must do all we can now to protect them. All of us, Mr. Speaker, are called into the service of this blessed nation at this time of challenge, not as Democrats or Republicans, but as Americans. This pathogen does not recognize party lines, and no partisan solution will defeat it. Neither will the government acting alone. It will take all the ingenuity and innovation of the American private sector, working with our federal, state, and local governments. This is not a time for cynicism or invective or second-guessing. This is a time to remember that we are citizens of the greatest nation on earth, that we have overcome every challenge we have faced, and we will overcome this one. We are one nation, Mr. Speaker. We should all be rooting for our president to succeed, for New York Governor Cuomo to succeed, for California Governor Newsom to succeed, for Wyoming's Governor Mark Gordon to succeed. Indeed, we must do everything we can to help every state and every governor in our great union. The bill we are voting on today is a crucial step. On the Sunday after 9/11, my family worshiped at Evergreen Chapel at Camp David with the families of cabinet officials and service members who were assigned there, many of whom would go on to serve overseas in the following years. That morning, as our nation faced another time of testing, the chaplain urged us work
from Texas.
Mr.
as though
Speaker, additional 30 seconds.
Gentlelady has additional 30 seconds.
That morning, as our nation faced another time of testing, the chaplain urged us, work as though everything depends on you, because it does, and pray as though everything depends on God, because it does. We will defeat this virus, we will restore our economy, we will heal our nation. We are Americans. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield myself 10 seconds. And I thank the gentlelady from Wyoming for her remarks. I'm sure that all of us on this floor can subscribe to them, and hopefully we act accordingly. I thank her for her remarks. But now I yield to my friend from Nevada, another senior member of the Congress of the United States, Congresswoman Dina Titus.
For how much time?
1 minute.
Gentlelady from Nevada is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you to the leader. Whenever our economy is hurting, my congressional district in the heart of Las Vegas is always among the hardest hit. This time is no different. The people who work at restaurants in Chinatown, clean hotel rooms on the Strip, and entertain visitors downtown are struggling to pay rent and feed their children. I want them to know that this recovery package was put together with them in mind. It will provide direct payments to most Americans, expand unemployment insurance, and give small businesses increased access to low-interest loans. It will add more oversight to corporate borrowing while helping make sure that Southern Nevadans will have a job to return to when this is over. The bill will also send more resources to hospitals to make sure that our heroic healthcare workers on the front lines of this epidemic have the resources they need. We've all been inspired by the example they've set in this difficult time. I thank them and
Gentleman
the first
from
responders.
Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Gianforte.
Gentleman from Montana is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, last night we learned a Montanan died to COVID-19, the first in our state. Our hearts are heavy back home. Mr. Speaker, Montanans are concerned. They're concerned about the health of their families and communities. They're concerned about the fallout from this outbreak. They're concerned they may have to shutter their businesses and lay off their workers. They're concerned they may not have a job tomorrow or see their next paycheck. We're addressing many of these concerns today in the CARES Act. It helps families and workers so they can pay their bills and put food on the table. It provides loans and grants to small businesses so they can keep their doors open. It boosts funding to support those on the front lines, from hospitals to healthcare providers, the CDC, and the VA clinics. Mr. Speaker, I encourage my colleagues to vote for the CARES Act and provide emergency relief to American people facing this crisis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to a retired Navy commander who has been on the front line herself and knows what the front line is all about. Ms. Loria from the state of Virginia.
For 1 minute.
1 minute.
Gentlelady from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. This is a necessary step in providing relief to families and small businesses throughout coastal Virginia and across America. This bill provides critical funding in helping our communities thrive again when this crisis passes. As we prepare to provide relief for the American people amid this national emergency, I'm reminded of the words that President Kennedy would have spoken were it not for his untimely loss on November 22nd, 1963. This is a time for courage and a time for challenge. Neither conformity nor complacency will do. Neither the fanatics nor the faint-hearted are needed. So let us not be petty when our cause is so great. Let us not quarrel amongst ourselves when our nation's future is at stake. Let us stand together with renewed confidence in our cause, united in our heritage of the past and our hopes for the future. Determined that this land we love shall lead all mankind into new frontiers of peace and abundance.
Gentleman from Maryland is reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member who has voted against a number of large spending bills in the past, I have to admit this legislation has given me significant pause. But we as a nation face the largest threats that I have seen in my career as a doctor and certainly during the short time that I've spent in Congress. The President has declared a national emergency. Governors are instituting shelter-in-place orders nationwide, and consumers have been told not to consume because businesses have been told to shut their doors and not conduct business. If government is forcing them to shutter their doors, then our responsibility is to help them out. The American dream cannot be shut down by a virus. And that is why I will support this legislation, Mr. Speaker. It is time to put political gamesmanship aside and pass legislation for the health and the safety of our nation. Thank you, and I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point in time, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished lady representing the Virgin Islands, Ms. Stacey Plaskett.
Gentlelady from Virgin Islands is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Our nation faces the worst pandemic in most of our lifetime. We are indeed in unprecedented time. Like the rest of the nation and countries around the world, the Virgin Islands' life has significantly been altered. Americans need urgent action of this body, the Congress, to address this threat to the lives and livelihood of American people. We do so with passage of this bill. It's not a perfect bill, but this short-term action will go a long way to save lives, help the economy, and pave a path to recovery. Aside from support to healthcare and economy, one of the most important measures in this bill, in the CARE Act, is the support and investment we make in our children. The $30 billion in educational funds, as well as the $14 billion in allocated higher education, will do that. The foresight and fortitude of the Speaker and Democratic leadership to ensure that small businesses, local government, and American workers and families, often forgotten, are included in this bill, have gone a long way, and we thank you.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
I thank the Chairman.
Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Speaker, this is not a crisis caused by a specific industry or weak economy. It is a voluntary shutdown of our economy in order to save lives. As a result, our government needs to support the families and businesses that are directly feeling the pain of this national emergency. The CARES Act will buy the needed resources for our hospitals and healthcare providers to safely care for the sick, ensure that hardworking Americans receive income and increased unemployment benefits during the crisis, extend emergency loans to small businesses which are forgivable for retaining their employees during this crisis, and establish a stabilization fund for other stressed businesses and to maintain liquidity in our economy. This bill is not perfect, but it is a necessary response to an unprecedented crisis. With these policies, coupled with the efforts of the private sector and the American people, we will defeat the virus and be ready for what will truly be a great American comeback.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I yield to the chair of the Financial Services Committee and a senior member of the Congress of the United States, Maxine Waters from the state of California.
How much time?
4 minutes.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Senate amendment to H.R. 748, now referred to as the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act. Congress must take action to provide relief and assistance to the millions of people across the nation who are struggling in the midst of this national public health and economic emergency. With 3.3 million Americans filing for unemployment last week, 1 million Californians filing for unemployment in the last 2 weeks, and many families struggling to make ends meet, it is our duty as elected officials to step up and help them. Several weeks ago, as the chair of the Financial Services Committee, I led the Democratic members on the Financial Services Committee in devising a comprehensive plan to address the financial services aspects of the coronavirus crisis. I am pleased that today's bill includes some elements of this plan. The legislation before us takes important steps to protect and provide relief for consumers, renters, homeowners, and people experiencing homelessness. The bill would address the shortage of key medical supplies and equipment by providing $1 billion appropriation to the Defense Authorization Act Fund. It would support small businesses and local territory and state governments and ensure that any federal aid to corporations has conditions and independent oversight. The bill provides $4 billion to help combat the outbreak of this disease among the homeless community. Most importantly, building upon my proposal, most individuals and families across the country will receive a check or direct deposit for $1,200 for each adult and $500 for each child to help our families who are struggling during this unprecedented crisis. While I'm pleased that the legislation includes these provisions that Democrats fought for, while I support the bill's passage, I must make it clear that the legislation is far from comprehensive and that there are issues that it leaves unaddressed and areas where it falls short. H.R. 748 does not prohibit negative credit reporting during the crisis, forgive student loan debt, suspend all consumer credit payments, among other concerns. However, despite these shortcomings, this bill is the most consequential piece of legislation that many of us will ever vote on. The American people need help, and they need it now. And this bill represents a down payment on that relief. I look forward to working with the Speaker, my committee colleagues, the Senate, and others on the next phase of relief. While it is clear that Congress must pass a fourth package to address these and other shortcomings, the passage of today's bill is critical for all families and communities. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the top Republican on the Budget Committee, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a responsibility to the people we serve, and the moment is now to mitigate the damage to our people and our economy. For those who question the price tag, for those who question certain features in the bill, think of the images we've all seen that are unprecedented in our lifetimes. The senior citizen, only able to see family members through a window. Worse yet, Americans dying alone. The frontline medical professional fighting an invisible disease, risking their very lives to bring hope to a frightened public. The businessman fighting to stay solvent, to keep a workforce, and to live to see another day. the scientists and engineers desperately searching for an answer. Who among us can question the crisis we're in and the needs of the people we serve? By midday today, Mr. Speaker, let us be remembered for taking the action necessary to put aside our politics.
Gentleman's time's
and
expired.
deliver to
Gentleman
the
from
American
Texas
people. I yield back.
reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to the gentlelady from Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, who also has seen challenge up front and personal. And I yield to her 1 minute.
Gentlelady from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be voting for this bill for the children who are foregoing their school and for the millions of children for whom that means that they are losing the stability and the nutritional support that comes with it. I will be voting for this bill for my family members and my friends and constituents who have lost their jobs in the past 2 weeks because of this pandemic. I will be voting for this bill so that we may deliver support to the small business owners and restaurateurs throughout Central Virginia who have closed their doors in order to stop this pandemic and keep their neighbors safe. And I will be voting for this bill for the healthcare workers in my district who are risking their lives to make our community safer. And I am grateful to the sanitation worker, the mail carriers, the UPS workers, the FedEx workers, the grocery store workers, those who work in our nursing homes and facilities across our district and across our country. I thank them for adding a bit of stability to our country during this incredibly difficult time.
Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to the time remaining?
The gentleman has 53.5 minutes. And the gentleman from Maryland has 39 minutes. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute to my fellow Texan, Mr. Flores.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, a few days ago, White House and congressional Republicans presented a bold bipartisan plan of action to help hardworking Americans deal with our current challenges. This plan puts much-needed resources where they're most needed: our families, our healthcare system, our small businesses, other businesses affected by this crisis, and our state and local governments. One of the things that we found out during this crisis is that our healthcare system supply chain relies far too much on foreign sources like Communist China. We can never allow this to happen again. In order to fix that problem, I am pleased that Senate and House negotiators included my request to fund $3.5 billion to utilize 3 existing centers in innovation for advanced development and manufacturing. One of these CIADMs is part of the Texas A&M University system, which I represent. These public-private CIADM partnerships are uniquely positioned to accelerate research, development, and manufacture of vaccines and therapeutics to mitigate pandemics, and they do it right here in America. Today,
from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve my
gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to yield 1 minute to my friend, gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the coronavirus emanated from China is here. We can't stop that. We can't go back. But I am distressed by the Hobson's choice that we have. It is ravaging our communities. It is ravaging our healthcare system. It is ravaging our economy. And we should be solely focused on healing our communities and saving the small businesses, the big businesses, and the economy that makes America great. So as we discuss this and also discussed a fourth, yet another package, no more Hobson's choice, no more billion-dollar bailouts for things that are unrelated, no more policies that are long-standing for a short-standing issue that needs our critical attention. Mr. Speaker, whatever we do, let's do no harm. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute to my fellow Texan, Dr. Burgess.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for the recognition. Our country is in a war, a crisis, unlike anything that has been seen for over 100 years. But there are heroes. We know our first responders. We know our doctors and nurses on the front line in our intensive care units. We know what heroes they are. But you know, Mr. Speaker, not all heroes wear capes. Certainly our doctors and nurses don't wear capes. I've got a furniture manufacturer in my district, Barbara Caldwell, who called me last weekend and said she wanted to transition her furniture manufacturing to manufacture personal protective equipment, and she is doing so. I had an aircraft manufacturer who said they wanted to manufacture ventilators, and they've are changing their clean room and hiring the engineers so they can do that. We do have heroes in this country. They don't always wear capes. I also want to recognize the hard work done by the Health Subcommittee staff, J.P. Poliskevitz, Christian Shatansky, Christian Sam, Caleb Graff, and then on my staff, Elizabeth Allen, Casey Pachunka, Rachel Huggins, and my Chief of Staff, James Decker, who are all over in the office right now, making certain that this goes smoothly. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland. Reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, Dr. Harris.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we're here a week too late. Not because we didn't know what our citizens and businesses needed, but because too many in the congressional swamp felt that you never let a serious crisis go to waste. Filling this important bill with pork and earmarks, like $25 million to the Kennedy Center, $75 million to NPR, $75 million to the National Endowment of the Humanities, instead of more masks and ventilators. But, Mr. Speaker, many Americans do need our thanks. Thank you to the frontline healthcare workers who selflessly and compassionately care for victims of the Wuhan virus. Thank you to President Trump for his leadership and for his transparency with the American people in this time of crisis. Thank you to my anesthesiologist colleagues who've stepped up to the challenge. They're trained in intensive care, and the ventilators on their anesthesia machines could prove critical if this fight escalates. Finally, thank you to all those Americans who have followed the President's recommendation on 15 days to slow the spread of the Wuhan virus. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Gentleman from Maryland reserves.
Reserves.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As all of our colleagues came in yesterday and this morning and make an effort to get back, it was important that we were all home last week. I was home last week and got to talk to her barber. Sole proprietor has his own shop, had to close down because of the order. Now he's going to have an income. I talked to a businessman who said, I'm going to have to lay people off for the first time in 40 years of business, and almost in tears. After this bill passes, he will not have to do that. Or the businesswoman that says I have a rent payment due at the end of the month. After this bill passes, she'll be able to pay her rent. Mr. Speaker, I'm humbled that today I'm going to vote for the largest bill in American history. I think it should make us all a little nervous. But it is after being home, listening to the stories of those in our communities, it is the right thing to do. I encourage to support our communities and support those making our country better. And I'm here to say I'm going to support this bill, and I encourage my colleagues to do so as well. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland
reserves.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to yield 1 minute to our gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. This bill is indeed historic, the largest disaster relief package in American history. I'm disappointed, as many of my constituents are, that much of this bill is not directly related or targeted at emergency relief, but that's the cost of doing business in a divided government in such divided times. Indeed, much that was on the last-minute ideological wish list has been removed and focus returned to the virus and its economic effect. A colleague said earlier this is much like a 9/11 moment. It's up to us today. Highlights include help for our revered veterans, nearly $20 billion for their medical care, homeless vets, and modernizing VA telehealth. Expansion of telehealth into rural America, like my own district, to bridge that gap in rural services technology also. $350 billion in guaranteed SBA loans, cushioning the blow and providing much stability for small businesses so that their employees will have jobs waiting when the all-clear signal finally sounds. It's my hope and prayer this act hits the targets and brings certainty that I hope most of us in this room desire, and importantly, meet the needs of the very
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Stability. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the former county executive in Long Island, Tom Suozzi of New York.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as you know, my father was born in Italy, and he would say, what a country. And my grandfather at family weddings would give advice to the new couples and say, non ci sono rose senza spine. You can't have a rose without the thorns. Well, right now, we mourn the thorns in our country right now. So many people are suffering because of their health, because of their sickness, because they're worried about their family's finances, and because of the deaths that have taken place. But today we have to also celebrate the roses, those essential workers that are working for the common good every single day, the grocery workers, the postal workers, the healthcare workers, the people that are on the front lines every single day, looking out for us every single day. And I want to celebrate today the roses of life of Democrats and Republicans coming together for the common good, putting aside ideological purity and working together to try and help people that are facing these desperate times. Mr. Speaker, God bless this country and God bless all of our American people. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserved. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pence.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I got in my car and drove to Washington, D.C. from Columbus, Indiana, on behalf of the voters in the Indiana 6th District. I'm here to support President Trump and be a voice for Hoosiers who need relief from this virus now. I've been fully engaged in making sure that this package preserves the health and livelihood of Americans. We need to protect the health of Americans and get them back to work. Congress has come together to provide relief and support for hospitals, families, workers, and small businesses. I came here to fight for Hoosiers' prosperity and the American dream. We can't afford to wait another minute for relief. Let's do our job and get it done. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to Mr. Swalwell from the state of California.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will get through this. That's who we are. That's what we do. Throughout our country's history, with leadership and resources, the American people have shown resilience to overcome every crisis we faced. This will be no different. As we meet here in this chamber across America, from Eden Hospital in Castro Valley, California, to hospitals in New York City, our health workers, our doctors, our nurses, our receptionists, the janitors who support them, are toiling away to heal the sick. We see you, we hear you, we need you. And this bill, more than for anyone else, is for you. This relief package also helps the next generation. Student borrowers, people who are working their first jobs and paying off their student loan debt, and without a paycheck find themselves in financial quicksand. This allows you to cancel your payments through the end of the fall and also suspends the accrual of interest. We will get through this. It's just who we are, and it's what we do. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserved. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Michigan, Reverend Wahlberg.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act and our president. This pandemic has upended life for everyone. I've heard from workers living from paycheck to paycheck who face an uncertain future. I've heard from struggling farmers. I've heard from small business owners who suddenly can't make payroll or rent. I've heard from courageous healthcare professionals and first responders who desperately need personal protective equipment to continue to care for the sick. These are incredibly trying times. While the CARES Act won't solve every unique challenge, help is on the way. America has faced periods of profound adversity in the past. Each time we prevailed. Together as Americans, we will do so again. But may we remember that while our nation is locked down, our Creator God is wide open to our prayers. Let's
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I am very proud to yield to one of the first two Native American women to serve in the Congress of the United States. And this bill, of course, reaches out to our tribal communities to make sure that they're whole. I yield to Ms. Holland from New Mexico.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this global crisis causes us to ask,
How do we value the workers who grow and harvest our food? How do we value healthcare workers who risk their own lives for our loved ones? How do we value the people who educate and care for our children? Democrats fought hard to ensure this bill includes comprehensive support for healthcare workers. It also creates a $150 billion relief fund so that state, local, and tribal governments can fight this pandemic. I know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. This stimulus package provides direct payments to working families so they can pay bills. The Small Business Rescue Plan will aid small businesses and nonprofits in New Mexico to maintain their existing workforce and pay rent. Yet still, Congress must continue to act. Even after we stop the spread of this virus, we must ensure our families have the help they need. I support the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act because we must battle this threat together. And Chairman, I yield.
Gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COVID-19 is hitting our country hard and fast, but Americans across our country and in my home district in Northeast Ohio are rallying together to confront and overcome this latest challenge. In Ohio's 16th district, we have seen restaurateurs with now empty dining rooms making free meals for students in Green Local School District. We have seen businesses like Bueller's Grocers do everything they can to prevent layoffs and support employees who come to work every day to ensure their shelves are stocked for those who need it. Our hospitals are bracing for impact, but we have seen our healthcare providers like the Cleveland Clinic and university hospitals working their hardest to innovate through this crisis by developing their own tests and launching drive-through testing facilities. Our great governor, Mike DeWine, is setting the gold standard of leadership in response to this crisis. He is taking decisive action to flatten the curve and save lives in the Buckeye State. This bill provides critical resources for those who need it most: our heroic healthcare workers, our small businesses, the unemployed, and our local leaders who are fighting this virus on the front lines.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I vote yes.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Staten Island, who himself has been on the front lines fighting for freedom and now fighting for our people. Max
Thank
Rose.
you, sir.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this bill because each and every day, New Yorkers, people in my own community are dying. I rise today in support of this bill because our frontline soldiers of this war, our nurses and our doctors, need masks. I rise today because days from now, weeks from now, New Yorkers will need thousands of more ventilators. I rise today because hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers have been laid off. And I rise today in support of this bill because this virus doesn't see party affiliation, and today we rise as Americans, not Democrats or Republicans. And lastly, I rise today in support of this bill because this is just the beginning. More work will need to be done. New York needs more help. But we're Americans, and we can get the job done. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to yield 1 minute. Gentleman from Florida, Dr. Dunn.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. I rise in strong support of the CARES Act. COVID-19, otherwise known as the coronavirus, has seriously impacted our country both medically and economically. During this unprecedented time, it's imperative that we not only take proper precautions, but react in an effective manner. This bill is not perfect. It has a very large price tag. However, a crisis of this magnitude requires Congress to act swiftly and decisively. This bill represents a bipartisan compromise that can make this happen. We have single household incomes, seniors on fixed incomes, and small business owners who need relief right now. My constituency is still rebuilding after Hurricane Michael, and I intend to do whatever it takes to get them the help they need right away. This is an excellent opportunity for us all to come together and support our constituents. Please join me in supporting this stimulus package, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud to stand here today and to say to my constituents in Phillipsburg and Dover and Clark who are out of work, to our restaurant owners in Somerville and Summit, to our nurses and doctors at Overlook and Hunterdon Medical, help is on the way. This does not mean we're done. There's so much more to do for our local governments, for example, for our hospitals and healthcare system. Congress must keep working. Let's use technology. Let's use remote voting. Let's have virtual hearings to make sure this money we're approving goes out the door quickly and to the right people. And let's remember, we are not here today rescuing the economy because of a virus. We are rescuing the economy because of our failure as a nation to test for that virus. So Congress will do our job. We will take care of the economy. I implore the President to work with us, Republicans and Democrats, to fix the supply chain for masks, for ventilators, for test kits.
Time's expired.
Don't talk about reopening America till we've done what we must to reopen it safely.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Think of this. Doesn't it feel like it was just yesterday the Federal Reserve Chairman was telling us we were in the Goldilocks economy? The wage growth, particularly wage growth for the working poor, was the best in modern economic times. I will argue we need to find a path back to that. That economic growth was moral. It was an amazing thing. Good things were happening. And then we hit this black swan. This is ripping my heart out because there's things in this bill that just don't belong there. I consider them, well, I can't say that word in front of a microphone, but we all have these moments in our political lives where we walk up front of this microphone and we're going to say, I'm going to have to vote for something that has things in it that break my heart, but we must do the right thing. We must get back to that economic growth. We must get back to that prosperity that was enveloping this country. And hopefully, we will look back, do a great postmortem, understand the things we did wrong, and fix them in the future.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to my friend from Massachusetts, Mr. Steve Lynch.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill, and I want to associate myself with the remarks of the gentlelady from Wyoming. Although in recounting the heroes of 9/11, she forgot the United States Postal Service workers, and we have forgotten them in this bill. During 9/11, the United States Postal Service workers continued to deliver the mail despite the anthrax attacks, and they continued to deliver medical supplies and medicines to every home and business in America today, 6 days a week, yet they received no benefits from this bill. We need them also to execute a delivery by mail system, a vote by mail system in this crisis to preserve our democracy as this crisis continues. So we need to fix that in the upcoming, in the next bill that we consider for this type of relief. We have to remember the United States postal workers and the great job they've done on behalf of our country. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Indiana, Dr. Bouchon.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, these unprecedented times call for unity to help Hoosiers and all Americans who are struggling medically and or financially through no fault of their own. This relief package puts Americans first with aid for families, workers, small businesses, and companies that employ millions of people. There's assistance for healthcare providers who are on the front lines working tirelessly to save our friends, neighbors, and family members from COVID-19, in addition to their usual duties. I'm proud to see that 2 provisions I've helped author are included in this package. These bipartisan policies will ensure patients have timely and affordable access to COVID-19 preventive care, such as vaccines and testing, and to make clear doctors who provide volunteer medical services during this public health emergency have liability protections. I've spent the past week talking to hospitals in Indiana, and it could not be clearer. They need our help, just as we need their help to defeat the virus and keep our loved ones safe. I urge my colleagues to support this package so we can provide relief Americans desperately need. I yield.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to my friend from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you. I rise today in favor of this bill, but also to say thank you to my brothers and sisters who are on the front line. Yes, those who work in the supermarkets, who are delivering the mail, who keep the lights on, who keep the water running. We're thanking them because they're making a sacrifice today. We've always been tough. Americans are special, and we will rise to this occasion. Fate calls us, we will answer, and we want to say thank you to everyone here and to all those serving America. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the former chairman of the Energy Committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's face it, coronavirus has totally disrupted our lives across the country, in every community, and certainly around the globe. To all of us, it's frightening. It's a nightmare. This bill is a partial response to end that disruption. It provides our medical workers and our hospitals, our small businesses, and virtually every family needed assistance. So to you who oppose this bill, please stand down. We can't wait another day to help. Don't add to this disruption by, in fact, being a disruptor. Be a leader. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, again, I have the opportunity to yield to one of our most senior members, the gentlelady from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee. 1 minute.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I join my friend from Michigan. There should be no one that rises to object in spite of the fact that we know there are challenges in this bill. But I hear these words: we are scared, we are stressed, the words of an emergency room doctor. These are the ones that are on the front lines right now today, when we have the largest number of cases in the whole nation and over 1,100 dead. Now we have $500 billion for industries with oversight, $350 billion for small businesses that include the micro businesses, the gig economies, and faith institutions and nonprofits. I will fight to make sure all of our nonprofits get it, all for direct payments for individuals, as well as $100 billion for hospitals. I watched as the Memorial Medical Center gave out over 1,100 tests, a small hospital putting themselves on the front line. Here's my words, Mr. Speaker. No man is an island. Each man's death diminishes me, for I'm involved in mankind.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized. The gentlelady is no longer recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, these are challenging times for our country. Yet throughout our history, America has risen to every challenge, and today is no different. I want to thank our President, Donald Trump, for his strong leadership during this crisis. Now, I don't like everything in this bill. While we've kept out dangerous provisions like union bailouts, the Green New Deal, and election schemes, it still has items I don't agree with, and I worry about the price tag. However, families, hospitals, and small businesses need immediate relief. I'm talking about a small business in Concord where the owner's doing his best, but still had to furlough many of his 30 employees. He told me he can put most of his employees back on the payroll using the SBA 7A loan program in this bill. It's workers and small businesses like this one that are counting on this legislation. It's not perfect, but I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Ohio, Joyce Beatty.
Gentlelady from Ohio is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, the world is watching us. Today's $2 trillion aid is relief and economic security for all Americans. We worked hard to provide health care disaster needs and to ensure Americans and workers and families come first. $350 billion in forgivable loans to small businesses, independent contractors like barbershops and beauty salons and more. First-time funding for not-for-profits and churches, which we must include minorities minority-led and minority-serving not-for-profits, $1,200 in direct payment to individuals and couples, $500 to children. The nation is watching us.
Expired.
Vote for this bill.
Gentleman
Thank
from
you.
Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, please to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of Congress, I've spoken with constituents, business owners, and community leaders over the last few weeks who are apprehensive about their health and financial security. As a practicing physician, I've spoken with numerous infectious disease physicians, scientists, epidemiologists about the present COVID-19 threat. While there are several provisions in this bill that are not necessary, I'd rather not dwell on its imperfections, and I will support it. Instead, I'd like to thank House and Senate members, as well as Secretary Mnuchin and President Trump for negotiating a bipartisan deal in a timely manner to provide relief to the American people. The CARES Act provides desperately needed funding to those who need it in this unprecedented time in this nation's history. Families, small businesses, churches, community institutions will receive the funding that they need to stay viable while we continue to fight the outbreak of COVID-19. I would like to urge employers to keep their employees employed and access the benefits that this bill provides to keep them financially
Gentleman's
afloat.
time's expired. Gentleman from Texas
I'd like to thank
reserves.
our healthcare workers.
Gentleman from
and pray for
Maryland is
them.
recognized.
30 seconds.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from California, Mr. Brad Sherman.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
This virus is a machine gunning America. This bill provides $2 trillion to bandage some of the wounds. We must stop the machine gun. Less than 1% of this bill goes for medical research. Our economic system provides significant incentives to the private sector to research patented drugs, but we should do more. The next bill should provide $5 billion to the NIH to evaluate every reasonable research alternative, particularly those compounds that the private sector will not investigate.
The gentleman
namely
from
the
Maryland
generic drugs.
reserves.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the CARES Act. We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has greatly affected the health and livelihoods of people around the globe. Mr. Speaker, this bill, it's not perfect, but it's a solid step forward to providing the relief needed to revive our economy. There's no doubt that as a nation, we've endured tough times in our history, but we've always come back stronger and more resilient. I'm proud today to be here representing West Tennessee during this trying time.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we've never faced a public health threat of this magnitude. Hardworking people have lost their jobs and are on the edge of making rent or putting food on the table. That's why our rescue efforts have been focused on people. This bill offers additional unemployment benefits, injects billions into our healthcare system, provides billions to small businesses to keep their workers on payroll, and gives every eligible adult a $1,200 check or $500 for every eligible child. However, this bill isn't perfect. It leaves out immigrants who contribute to our economy, pay taxes, and are also on the front lines of this pandemic. This virus does not discriminate based on immigration status or race, and our response shouldn't either. However, despite that, this shortcoming, I do plan to vote for this bill, and I urge all my colleagues to do the same. Hardworking families are at risk, where they need help now. Many lives are at
Gentlelady's
stake.
time's expired.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the ranking Republican of Homeland Appropriations. Gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fleischman.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill. To my colleagues in this great House, the People's House, we have been here in times of triumph and in times of tragedy. This is the latter. It is a time for civility, it is a time for unity, and it is a time for us to serve the American people and pass this bill. Let our resolve be to defeat this virus. No malady, no virus, no adversity will ever erode the great American Republic. God bless us all, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to another former member of the armed forces who has seen combat face to face and knows what crisis we have today, Mikey Sherrill from the state of New Jersey.
1 minute. Gentlelady from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
1 minute.
I rise today with an incredible amount of pride to speak for the people of New Jersey, to speak for the heroes in healthcare who have labored around the clock to provide the best care in the nation. I rise for those workers and for the first responders who are running out of personal protective gear. I rise for the brave men and women who are going through these tough times to help us, the grocery store workers, delivery people, volunteers bringing food to the elderly and the sick. I rise for our manufacturers, our researchers, our state and local officials, and I rise for everyday families, small business owners and laborers who are losing their jobs and not sure what the future holds. I rise for everyone in my great state to tell you that together we will beat this. In Congress, I will continue to work to get you the relief you need, and this nation, we, as a people, have always come together in a crisis, and I've seen firsthand that this time is no different. And so I rise today to ask that God bless this House, God bless the state of New Jersey, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Spino.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise to speak in favor of the CARES Act with optimism. On one hand, cautious optimism because we face unprecedented challenges. But on the other, confident optimism of what can be accomplished when we work together. We come together for those who bravely working on the front lines of the fight, our nurses and doctors at Lakeland Regional, Brandon Regional, South Lake Hospital, one of the many other medical providers across my district. We come together for families, like the single mom who worked 2 jobs in Florida's tourism industry to keep food on the table, but now doesn't know when her next paycheck will come. We come together to support the backbone of our economy, small business. I've spoken to many small business owners this week who are desperately trying to figure out how to keep their employees. As a former small business owner myself, I understand the decisions that you are facing. As a fiscal conservative, I'm cautious about this bill, but I understand the cost our country would pay without it. When we face adversity, we rise to confront the threat head on. But for those in Florida's 15th district and around the country, remain optimistic because we will win this fight together. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
1 minute. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my colleague from Maryland, David Trone.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, our nation has never seen anything like the coronavirus outbreak. At a time when our American business are forced to close and American families face fear and uncertainty, we do what Americans do best. We come together and support one another. My background is business. I run a small business and a large organization. This bill puts workers first. It's good for the American business. Puts workers first with additional $600 a week in unemployment insurance. Puts families first, funneling $1,200 directly into the pockets of Americans. Supports small business with $377 billion infusion for fast relief grants and loans. This bill is what the American people and the American economy need. It's time to come together as one nation, united against this outbreak. I urge support for this bill and yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, please yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
A month ago, our nation stood on the highest mountaintop, marveling at the supposed limitlessness of our domain. Today, barely 3 weeks later, awakening from an abundance-induced stupor, we find ourselves deep in the valley, peering perilously into the abyss. I hope that the safety net we are attempting to purchase today with our nation's scarce treasure doesn't dull too much the alarm that this crisis has sounded for our country to reform its ways. I pray that from this low point, we will seek out a great revival of faith in our Almighty God and a renewed commitment to the principles of freedom, liberty, and self-reliance. For those in this Congress who have used this crisis to loot the public treasury and serve special interests above the common good, I trust that our people and history will judge you as harshly as you deserve. And today I give thanks for our president.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to yield 1 minute to our distinguished colleague from Maine, Mr. Jarrett.
The gentleman from Maine is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, thousands of Mainers are staying home and doing their part to bend the curve in the fight against the coronavirus. But thousands of healthcare professionals, shipbuilders, grocery store employees, and many others deemed essential got up this morning and went to work. They'll do their jobs in this difficult time despite the risk because people depend on them. Congress shouldn't be any different. We're about to vote on a bill in response to the pandemic sweeping through our nation and the growing economic crisis that follows it. Nearly 900 pages long, my office received the text a little over 24 hours ago. I'll be honest, many of us are still working to understand this bill in full. Portions drafted by lobbyists with loopholes you might drive a Mack truck through. Only time will tell whether this behemoth will fully deliver on its economic promises. It won't fully stop the deepening recession. Only the loosening of the tourniquet will let the blood flow back into our economy, but that is not yet an option. I will, however, support this relief act. It's not a stimulus, it's an emergency relief act, providing $100 billion to hospitals.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from
Thank you
Virginia
very much.
reserves.
I appreciate
Gentleman
it.
from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we're here today debating a massive stimulus bill, not by choice, but by duty. The coronavirus is an unseen enemy that threatens countless American lives, a nuclear bomb to our economy. Yesterday, we learned a record 3 million plus Americans have filed for unemployment. Workers are hurting, small businesses are hurting, thousands of Americans are sick. Health experts tell us we have several more weeks of this collective suffering ahead. But there is good news, lots of it. Americans from coast to coast are pitching in to help the cause. Businesses are changing their production lines to make ventilators and hand sanitizer. Surgical masks are being donated by the millions, and we're lining up to give blood. Healthcare workers are being cheered like rock stars during shift changes. Americans are pulling together. Everyday heroes are emerging teachers, teaching their classes over the internet. Doctors and nurses working superhuman shifts while friends and neighbors step up to provide child care for them. We're seeing the best of America. Now the House must do its part. Vote yes.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Mary Gay Scanlon, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
1 minute. Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise to support the CARES Act, the third relief package that will pass through the House this month, and we know it's not the last. This bill will help protect the health, safety, and economic security of all Americans. I want to say that I'm so grateful to our state and local officials, our first responders and healthcare workers, our postal and grocery workers, all of whom are fighting for our communities. And I'm grateful to our friends and neighbors for listening to our medical experts and staying home to slow the spread of the coronavirus. But they can't do it alone. As the numbers of patients and deaths are mounting, our doctors and nurses are telling us they're working without the protective gear and medical equipment they need. We need to end the disconnect between what the president is saying and what is really happening in America. We need the president to use the Defense Production Act to produce and distribute the medical supplies we need. I'm so grateful to our colleagues for moving quickly to pass this bill and help the American people, and I urge the president to do the same. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from
Texas.
Texas is recognized.
The great state of Texas. Thank you. I yield Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to Mr. Raskus, Florida.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is a historic moment in the U.S. House. We need to pass an unprecedented economic package that will prevent financial disaster for millions of Americans. We must give people working again. This bill funds programs for small businesses, including independent contractors and nonprofits. It provides up to $1,200 for taxpayers who earn $75,000 or less, as well as $500 per child. Additionally, seniors and disabled veterans are also eligible for checks. These payments will not be considered taxable income for 2020, Mr. Speaker. Most importantly, critical funding to provide personal equipment and test kits for healthcare professionals is on the way. For sure, this is a spending bill. I'm not happy with everything, but I will vote yes to save the lives and livelihood of my constituents. I ask for swift passage as soon as possible, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate it very much.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished lady from Michigan, Elise Lutkin.
Gentlelady from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Think about the most iconic images from 9/11. Just after the attacks, people running away from the towers as our first responders were running towards the flame. It was a generational event. Today, as so many stay home, those who are running towards the crisis are our healthcare workers, our first responders. They are on the front lines. Our supermarket workers, our truck drivers, our border agents and TSA agents. Right now, we are sending them into the fight without the gear that they need. We owe them our passion. We owe them to work together, Democrats and Republicans. And above all, we owe them a plan. Meanwhile, Americans are doing their best. Michiganders are coming together in ways that I could hardly imagine, from the big three autos to our smallest manufacturers, trying to fill the gaps. Today, here, we must do our part. We must pass the CARES Act. It is imperfect. It is the third appropriation. I hope there will be a fourth, but it is our duty to come together and pass it. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the pain being felt in South Jersey and in this nation is real. I have listened and I have heard the stories. What we're doing today will soothe some of the pain, but it's just the beginning. America was founded and has thrived with the idea that we are an exceptional nation. We are exceptional, not because of our differences, but because of what unites us in times of adversity. This legislation is a testament to our strength that we show in that unity. While we must maintain a physical distance from one another to slow the curve of our hidden enemy, we must remain closer than ever in our hearts and in our souls to one another. I stand with my colleagues ready to fight this disease, fight for our families, fight for their jobs, and fight to keep our nation. May God bless America, and may God bless all of us as we go forward with our work.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Hoyer.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence.
Gentlelady from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise today in support of the CARES Act. At this time, our country needs this Congress to act with a bipartisan commitment to ensuring the safety and the well-being of our constituents. Although this package is not perfect, we must support our postal workers. We must ensure our municipalities have the funding to survive. But it will provide immediately workers, families, and health professionals and first responders the resources that they need. Today, we can provide direct cash infusion into our economy, and we will provide more than $170 billion to support and purchase the needed PPEs and give our hospitals grants to offset the revenue and losses. However, our work is not done. As confirmed cases in Michigan and across the country continue to rise, I will work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisles to address the outstanding issues. And I want to say, God bless America, and we need to do our work. I yield back.
Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the people of Central Kentucky in support of the most aggressive fiscal stimulus in American history. Founding Father John Adams famously said that every problem is an opportunity in disguise, and this insidious virus and the resulting shutdown of our economy is a very serious problem. But because of the spirit of the American people, it is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to support the heroic work of America's hospitals and healthcare workers and doctors and give them the resources they need to stay safe and take care of the sick. It's an opportunity to go to war against this virus and unleash the creative energies of America's private sector and help our scientists and researchers find therapies, a vaccine, and a cure. It's an opportunity to give American workers, small business owners, and families the cash flow they need to get back to work. It's an opportunity to provide liquidity and financial support to our markets to fuel a powerful economic recovery. And it's an opportunity to come together as a nation, not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans to rise to the occasion as we have done so many times before to confront this challenge and deliver a stronger, healthier, and more prosperous
from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I get the time remaining for both sides?
Yes, the Majority Leader, you have 22 minutes, and the opposing side, or the other side, 31 minutes.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Who are we calling on here? Page, who we have? Bill Huizenga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizenga.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the people of West Michigan for the individuals and families who have seen their world turned upside down by COVID-19. Our neighbors, friends, and family members are losing their income, small businesses are closing their doors, and manufacturers, big and small, are shuttering their facilities. All this is happening not because of bad business decisions or personal choices, but because of a virus. The CARES Act will deliver critical relief to West Michigan residents, small businesses, and our medical professionals. This package will help tens of thousands of constituents in my district stay employed. While I don't agree with every proposal included in this bill, the vast majority of it will work directly to provide relief to the people who need it most. Communities across the nation expect this body to act today. And finally, I want to say thank you to the first responders, nurses, and doctors who are serving our communities on the front lines. Thank you for the farmers, the food processors, the truck drivers, and those stocking the shelves to make sure goods are available in this time of need. We're all in this together, Mr. Speaker. God bless America. Let's pass this bill.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Is Mr. Buck here? Please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to oppose the CARES Act. I agree we are facing an unprecedented emergency, one tied directly to China's nefarious actions. However, as President Trump said, we cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. The President has shown strong leadership, seeking to help struggling families and small businesses. Congress must do the same, but we can't do so at the expense of our children and our grandchildren's future. The truth is, this bill will spend $6 trillion, not $2 trillion. Even that cost fails to include the cost of borrowing this money. There is no attempt by Congress to reduce spending elsewhere in the budget to pay for this bill. The sad truth is that most of this money in this bill is unrelated to fighting the coronavirus. We believe that the fight against the virus will take 6 to 8 weeks, yet this bill spends money decades into the future. While it is clearly necessary to do something to help our country fight this disease, this bill is not the answer. Our country needs help.
Gentleman's
but
time's
this cure is
expired.
worse than the problem.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
We're doing that.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, at this time I'll yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Leader, Mr. Speaker, at this time, just like I said last week, I say it again this week. The COVID-19 pandemic will get worse before it gets better. It will get worse for our public health. It will get worse for our financial health. And that is why I rise in support of the CARES Act. With these shelter-in-place orders, we are continuing to trying to flatten the corona curve. But when we do that, figuratively, we are putting our economy in a medically induced coma. A step that, as we've seen this week, has led to one of the worst employment rates in our history. That is why we need one of the biggest stimulus packages in our history. The CARES Act will expand unemployment insurance for restaurant, retail, and hotel workers on the Central Coast of California. It will assist my specialty crop farmers in the salad and berry bowls of the world. And it will provide small businesses across this country with the loans necessary to survive. With this bruising pandemic, we are asking our constituents to do something that's not normal, to stand down, to stay inside, to separate from one another.
Gentleman's time
they
has
are relying
expired.
on us
Gentleman from
to do the right
Maryland
thing, to step up and to support the
from
CARE Act.
Texas
Thank you,
is
Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
recognized.
Mr. Speaker, proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz.
Gentleman from
Mr.
Florida is
Speaker,
recognized for
as
1
a-
minute.
Mr. Speaker, as a fiscal conservative, $2.2 trillion of our grandchildren's money is a tough pill to swallow. But this is a two-front war on our economy and on public health. On the economic front, we must provide a lifeline to individuals, businesses, seniors that are suffering collateral damage. And on the health front, we must send reinforcements to our healthcare workers. This morning, I spoke with a physician and family member heading into the emergency room in Manhattan. She said she's scared. Like combat, I told her, you have to take a deep breath, stay focused, and do what you're trained to do. These hospitals are the Omaha Beach of this war. Colleagues, in the foxhole, nobody cares about race, religion, creed, socioeconomic background. They certainly don't care about Republican and Democrat. It's about mission. It's about country. We have a duty to provide these soldiers what they need. We have a duty to support this bill. I yield my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I think that's changed. Mr. Speaker, please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 10 days, I've seen the very best of America. I've seen restaurants like Umi Seafood and Lucille's Barbecue in Fort Wayne deliver thousands of meals to those who need it. I've seen TNT Floral Shop in Columbia City deliver flowers to every nursing home resident in my county. I've seen many lining up to donate blood. And I've seen so many healthcare professionals put themselves in harm's way on the front lines. Mr. Speaker, it's time for Congress to join them and bring relief to our neighbors who needed it yesterday. The CARES Act will keep the lights on in America. It will put cash in the hands of Americans who need help to pay their bills and put food on the table. And it will give a lifeline to small businesses when they need it most. This is by no means a perfect bill, but it gets help to the people who need it most. And I hope we will come back and make changes as needed in the near future. Mr. Speaker, in this time of national crisis, we must continue working together and with President Trump to keep our country in the fight. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please, proud to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COVID-19 didn't kill our economy. Government policies, however well-intentioned, did that. In just a few weeks, they've derailed the most promising and prosperous economy of our lifetimes and put us in imminent danger of permanently destroying millions of American jobs. The unprecedented spending in this bill threatens to destabilize the fiscal structure of our federal government and suppress future economic growth. But in order to deal with those issues, we must first arrest the damage caused by the actions that have plunged us into a recession. Temporary job losses will soon become permanent job losses without federally guaranteed loans to preserve those jobs and a way for families to recoup their financial losses. This bill does so, although inefficiently, wastefully, and at enormous cost. Despite all its flaws, passage of this bill is therefore imperative. But it is no substitute for getting Americans back to work.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me pleasure to yield 1 minute to our distinguished colleague from Massachusetts, Ms. Trahan.
Gentlelady from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since day one of this Congress, Democrats have committed themselves to a For the People agenda. Today is no different. The COVID-19 pandemic is impacting people across the world, our country, my district. And it is for the people that we stand here today to assist families, uplift workers whose basic livelihoods have been threatened, strengthen our community hospitals, and support our frontline healthcare workers. We are here to deliver relief to people, like the owner of a community bookstore in Andover, Massachusetts, whose business has been crushed, to keep our end of the bargain for the hospital workers at places like Lawrence General and Lowell Community Health Center, and so many others who are putting their lives on the line each day. And we are here for the families who are worried about their basic health and safety. This bill delivers for them. This is a time for bold action, and much more needs to come. For families struggling with the harsh realities of this situation, know that we will keep protecting you. We will take our lessons and courage from our frontline workers, from the families banding together to care for their loved ones, from the acts of kindness we are seeing all over our country as we stand united as Americans.
Gentleman
I support
from Virginia
this bill.
reserves.
Thank you. I
Gentleman
yield
from
back.
Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time remaining on both sides?
You have 20. Gentleman has 26 minutes, and the majority has 20 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Really pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From South Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, during times like this, it brings out the best and the worst. The best has been a president who's working nonstop. The best have been those businesses who are producing the masks and the things that we need. The best has been the churches that are praying nonstop. Now, the worst has been the price tag, and the worst has been the things that were added to this that had nothing to do with the coronavirus. So $25 million for the Kennedy Center, $75 million for the National Arts. This has nothing to do with the coronavirus. This nation shall survive, and in the words of Winston Churchill, there are times when doing our best isn't good enough. We will do what's required in spite of this. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to our friend from Florida, Mr. DeSoto.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as I rise here today, the United States has more coronavirus cases than any nation on the planet. This is an unprecedented crisis that requires an unprecedented response. This bipartisan bill is a promise that help is on the way. That help is on the way for families with $1,200 checks and $2,400 for married families, for food assistance, for the unemployed. Help is on the way with $600 in unemployment benefits on top of state benefits. Help is on the way for our seniors and our veterans with financial assistance. Help is on the way with small businesses through payroll grants and other costs. First responders and hospitals, help is on the way to confront this crisis. And to our farmers and to our students, help is on the way. It's time to pass this bipartisan bill and send a message to Central Florida and every American across every corner of this nation that there is help, because help and hope are on the way.
Gentleman's time. Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House is not in order.
The gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. Members are asked to take their conversations off the floor. Gentleman from Texas may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 1 minute. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it is unfortunate that this bill was delayed in pursuit of certain wasteful provisions that have nothing to do with the coronavirus. With that said, I'm thankful that the vast majority of this bill rightly focuses on the needs of Americans. It will save small business in my district, provides much needed funds to the hospitals on the front lines of this fight, and provides a safety net for people who lose their jobs due to no fault of their own. America is hurting. The American people need us now more than ever. Thanks to Leader McCarthy and President Trump and the members involved for their unrelenting work on this. To the American people, it is much later than anyone wanted, but help is on the way. I urge a yes vote. May God bless us all. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to our friend from California, Mr. Cox.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of today's bill, which is a bipartisan, good faith effort to begin to provide relief to millions of American families and workers. And while not perfect, it's a good start. In the last few weeks, I spoke to thousands of my Central Valley neighbors. Last week, I had a town hall where 9,000 constituents called in. They're scared, they're worried, but they're looking for guidance and leadership. And today, they're looking for relief. No American should have to go between paying rent and putting food on their table. But without immediate assistance, this is exactly the choice they'll have to make. As a representative of the top ag district in the top ag state, I'm proud this bill shores up vital safety net programs for our farmers, ranchers, and their families. But I'm disappointed about this bill's glaring shortcomings, which must be remedied in a future bill. This bill punishes mixed status households and denies some American citizens benefits they deserve. It does not put a penny in the
Gentleman's
CDFI
time's
fund
expired.
to
Gentleman
help
from
disadvantaged
Virginia
communities.
reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, please yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
We've gone from a story that barely affected Americans 3 weeks ago to a $2 trillion bill today. The cost is too high, but the crisis in response to government experts may be right and may be wrong, who said don't fly, don't eat out, don't worship together, don't go to school. Our economy was shattered. Was our president held up by irresponsible Democrats and too many irresponsible Republicans for excessive spending? Yes, but we must act to calm the panic and move back to normalcy. I flew here yesterday on the only Southwest flight from Milwaukee with 5 passengers. Usually there are 2 almost full flights. Restaurants are shuttered by the government and their employees are laid off. President